Hello everyone, welcome back to another video lecture. Today we're going to take a look at Leo Tolstoy's My Confession. So one thing I will say as a preface to this video lecture as well as the rest of them is that they aren't an absolute replacement for going through the original material yourself. Really what these are designed to accomplish is provide kind of scaffolding for you, hopefully provide you a fairly clear overall view of what's going on in the piece. I find that can be very helpful, particularly with philosophy. If you don't already have a good sense of the bigger picture, really what the author is aiming to accomplish, at least sometimes it can be very hard to make full sense of what's going on in particular sentences or particular paragraphs or particular pages. I know I myself, in trying to read particularly difficult philosophical authors, have at times read pages and pages that I understand very little of. But then once it clicks, once I realize what's really going on there, I can go back and reread that same material, and all of a sudden it makes an awful lot more sense because I have an idea. Really, if we think in terms of arguments, I have an idea what the conclusion is. I have an idea what sort of view they're committed to, what kind of premises that they're simply entertaining and thinking about, but ultimately reject, which ones they really endorse, ultimately what view they think is going to be the correct one. So hopefully that's what some of these lectures are going to give you, a good overview of what's going on in that material, some clarification of certain terms or background bits of history, things like that, that again can serve as an obstacle to understanding what's going on in there. So I certainly recommend going through the lectures, watching and listening, looking through the slides. But just doing that isn't really enough to successfully complete the course. You're going to have to carefully read and engage with at least some of this material. So given the structure of the course, in some sense, you don't have to master every single reading we have. If there's some of them that just don't interest you as much, or you have real difficulty trying to get through, having at least sort of a passing knowledge of all the course material, I would strongly recommend, and then really engaging with, really reading carefully, thinking about, ultimately evaluating some of these pieces is going to be necessary. And given the forum activities, basically at least one piece a week you need to engage with significantly enough to be able to come up with something to post on the forums. And then, of course, with the critical responses and then ultimately with the final essay, there's going to be a chance there to engage in more depth. One thing I'll also say is I've got a lamp on in front of me to try to get some shadow off my face, and I will be putting on my glasses from time to time because I've got, believe it or not, honest to goodness lecture notes that I'll be referring to as I go along. My apologies for any sort of glare or anything that's going to hit the glasses. I just can't come up with a good system to actually make sure my face is visible without getting some glare in the glasses. Maybe the correct response is not to have my face visible, and there probably wouldn't be too much lost. Okay, so this first author we're going to look at, really a 19th into early 20th century Russian author, very famous. You've almost certainly heard of War and Peace, which I've got lying around here somewhere, and it's a big, giant, huge, thick book. Wrote a number of other pieces as well. Now, really what we're getting here is something from Tolstoy's sort of later life, and he's really talking about sort of he really had basically a midlife crisis, where he went through sort of religious awakening, and that's really what we're getting a little bit of an autobiographical perspective on here. Tolstoy really telling us about what his life was like, how things were going for him, and then really he was hit by this question of, what's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of it all? Why am I doing these things? Can I even go on doing them? And he was really gripped with, I'll call it a kind of existential angst or perhaps despair. Really didn't know why he existed. Now, existentialism itself, really sort of a French philosophy of the 20th century, but you get in certain authors in the 19th century, including Tolstoy, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, some real anticipations of the existential movement and this real emphasis on the first person position, really who we are and how we feel and what our place is like in the world. So you can find in Tolstoy's written works echoes of the various themes he has, and you can actually see, if you read through them, how they take this sort of turn where his works up to a certain period in his life echo certain themes, and then afterwards there's really a change in what gets reinforced or what seems to really matter in them. So this piece, My Confession, this is what E.D. Klemke in the introduction was referring to as well in talking about the meaning of life. So in these lectures as well, I try to give you just a little short version. Here's what happens. Here's going to be the big movements in the piece. Here's what to look out for. So he raises this question of the meaning of life, outlines some various responses, rejects any response to the question of meaning that's based on reason, and ultimately endorses a faith-based response, really the only appropriate one when we ask about the meaning of life. So the question itself, as Tolstoy explains, and I won't go into all the detail, this again, good reason to read the original piece because Carl's not going to give you all the details of the original piece. He's going to point out, in some sense, the highlight reel. Here's the big movements. Here's a way to understand the whole thing. Here's some clarification on some of the technical vocabulary that's used, though not all. And I strongly encourage you, especially now in the age of the internet, you run across a word that you don't understand, rather than just sort of gloss over it and shrug and say, oh, who knows? Look it up, right? It only takes probably 5 seconds, maybe a little bit longer, but look it up. It will help increase your vocabulary, help increase your comprehension. And if you look it up and still it just doesn't make any sense, feel free to email me or swing by my office hours or something, and we can try to clear up what it means. So Tolstoy, when he's writing this piece, he's later on in his life, he's already very famous for his literary achievements, his writing, as he himself notes. He says, also strangers would congratulate him. He had all sorts of money, and he was world famous for his writing, which he himself, he didn't think it was all that much work, really. It wasn't that tough to do, or at least it didn't seem like it. He had a large farm estate. He was a noble person in Russia, had all sorts of farmers that would work his land and so on. So he had a great life. If you look at it in terms of, did he have a loving family? Yes. Was he famous? Yes. Was he financially successful? Yes. Did other people know him and think well of him? Yes. So if we're thinking about sort of a checklist of what sort of achievements can you have in sort of the secular material world that seem to constitute a good life, it seems like Tolstoy checked all the boxes. Everything he should have there to make him happy, make him a success in commercial terms, if that's the way we want to look at it. He had that. There really didn't seem to be anything he was lacking. But as his life went on, he said he started getting hit with this question, this kind of perplexity, this sort of feeling. He'd be going along, having a great life, and then he would slow down and sort of ask himself, well, okay, so, you're going to write another book and you're going to be even more famous, make more money. And then what? Write another book and get more famous, make more money? Why? Why bother? You've got a large farm estate that's going to be even larger and even better, and you're going to have even more livestock and people working for you and more horses and more land. So what? And you're going to make even more friends and more money, and so who cares? Right? Well, why does that matter in the first place? We can put together these checklists of the success conditions for a secular sort of material life. Why care about that at all? What's the point of it? What does it mean? Right? Why pursue our projects? So look, I'm a philosopher. Here I am, gainfully employed. Right? The envy of many philosophers. I get paid to think about interesting things and talk about them and talk to interesting people like you and read your work. And that's a pretty great life. I could have a far worse life. But overall, I'm very blessed or lucky, however we might want to put it. So what? Why keep doing that? Why get up in the morning? Why pursue my projects? Why try to achieve anything? Now, for Tolstoy, I think this question was even more pressing than it is for me. Also more interesting because he's even more famous and more successful. He's better. Well, okay, I just said more famous. That suggests I'm famous. I don't think that's really true, but at least a few people listen to the things I have to say. Now, as Tolstoy puts it, he would get confronted with this question, question for justification. Why do these things? Why do them at all? And they'd start just in little spurts, just little bits, and then they would sort of grow over time, and ultimately he was just gripped by it, almost paralyzed. Felt like he couldn't do anything but actually answering this question. And when he was first confronted with the issue, he himself thought it really wasn't all that important or pressing. He thought, well, look, there's, humans are aware of this kind of question, so obviously there's an answer out there that must be fairly easily accessible. It must be the kind of thing that I could figure out if I really needed to. And then it became more and more pressing, so finally he went through and actually tried to figure out what the answer was. Right? Now, when he looked into it and really thought about even trying to care for his family, raise his children, things like this, even that started to lose its meaning or its significance, its purpose, its justification. Note all these various words I'm throwing out as a way of trying to make sense of what Tolstoy is really asking. We're going to disambiguate at least some of these different questions as we move through the course. But generally, when we approach this issue, this issue of the meaning of life and these questions about it, often these questions come as a kind of package. If we're just sort of groping around, we're dealing with this sort of issue, ultimately we're going to wind up asking these various dimensions of the question. And so part of really what it is to engage with it and wonder about it and try to find a good answer is try to tease out the subtly different meanings that the question can have, what different sorts of answers might look like, and then figure out which of those dimensions are really worth pursuing or really worth having in a good answer, which ones aren't worth having. And if there are multiple dimensions to this question, different ways we can pose it or different specific details that might go into the answer, trying to figure out how those things are going to cohere with each other, how different parts of the answer are going to fit together or not fit together, as the case may be. So when thinking about his family and his projects and so on, Tolstoy sort of puts it beautifully at one point where he says, sooner or later there would come diseases and death to my dear ones and to me, and there would be nothing left but stench and worms. Now, really, what is he trying to get at here? Well, we all pursue our projects. We all think that in some sense our life is very important. It's worth doing a lot of things. But ultimately, we're going to die. And we're going to engage with this topic a little more directly in a little bit in the course. We're looking at death and the afterlife and immortality. But we die, right? As a human, you're almost certainly aware of the fact that at some point humans die. Our awareness of our mortality makes us fairly interesting creatures because we become aware of the fact that this is going to happen, and then generally speaking still pursue our projects anyway. Now, other creatures, there's a good question, to what degree are they self-aware of their own mortality? We look at other sorts of creatures and they go on doing the sorts of activities that keep them alive and propagate their species and so on. Presumably, they have less self-awareness than we do. We're quite self-aware and self-conscious of what we're doing, and we can reflect on what we're doing. So we can ask these sorts of justificatory questions. Why bother going through the motions? Particularly if it's just to stay alive and there's nothing further. Is it really worth going through, say, you have to work all day, every day, and the end product is just staying alive and there's no pleasure, satisfaction, or happiness or anything like that? Would that be a meaningful life? Right? Say you're some other sort of creature has to struggle all day to survive in nature. Is it really worth it? Now, of course, this is precisely where we might say this is just a stupid question. We're going to get there, and in fact, we're going to see, as we're going through the course, different thinkers are going to think there are different ways to interpret the question, some of which just really aren't worth pursuing. Other ways of interpreting the question makes it certainly worth pursuing. And at the end of the course, we'll think a little bit more about whether or not this is just a bad question in the first place. But we'll go through some positive answers first, because I think it's worth doing that before we then come around to this ultimate assessment of whether or not this question was really worth asking in the first place. So just think about Tolstoy. Even if he spends all his time and energy writing books and raising his family and so on, really what's going to be the end product? He's still going to be dead. His family's going to be dead. After not too long, depending on how you look at things, certainly his family members are almost certainly going to be forgotten. He'll probably be forgotten. Now, of course, we're still talking about him. We still know him. Here we are 100 years later, 110 years after he died, which really, if you take a long view of things, isn't very long at all. In the previous video, I was talking about the age of the universe. You know, let's just round it up to 14 billion years. Even the age of Earth, this is one I often forget. I want to say it's something like 4 billion years, but don't quote me on that. This would be a handy thing to Google. I should probably do that, but given that I'm in the middle of making the video, I don't want to interrupt it to figure that out. But you know, if you look at the age of our species, or just how long we've had recorded history, in the not too distant future, even though Tolstoy was a literary genius and very famous, and people still read his work and find it very illuminating, there's going to be other people. At some point, he's going to cease to be, you know, of extreme importance. He'll probably always be remembered to some extent by the human species. But if we just fast forward 10,000 years, assuming there's still humans in 10,000 years, I can almost guarantee you very few people are going to be talking about Tolstoy, because it's not like we're just sitting around lollygagging and there's no new literature being produced. And as finite creatures, we can only really read and engage and think with so much stuff. So at some point, even his great literary achievements are going to, in some sense, be lost or forgotten, or at least minimized in some sense. So why bother? Why write another book? Why get famous? Why bother raising your family or making money or doing any of these sorts of things? Well, this is precisely what Tolstoy was really gripped with. And ultimately, he just couldn't put the question down. He puts it this way at one point. While trying to just ignore the question, he says, I am unable to do so because I have been doing it too long before now. Now, I cannot help seeing day and night, which run and lead me up to death. I see that alone, because that alone is the truth. Everything else is a lie. Now, this reminds me of one little anecdote. When I was in high school, I was taking a philosophy class, and we had some kind of test, or it might have been a final exam coming up. And so, of course, people are asking questions about, you know, the test and what was going to be on it and how to do well and so on. And I remember asking, this is probably when I really became a philosopher, if there is such a thing, asking what importance the test was going to have for my life. You know, worst case scenario, I failed it. So what? I did poorly in the class, even say I failed the class. That doesn't sort of mean my life was a waste or that it's objectively gone better. There are these questions about, you know, how much do I care about it? How much should I care about it? If I take an all things considered view of how my life might go, that particular test or piece of written work or, you know, whatever it might be, how important is it really? Right? So expanding our sphere of concern. But if we expand our sphere of concern enough, right, going just from, say, this particular test to my whole life, well, then I can take my whole life as a rather small thing and think about the lives of all the people who are alive right now. Or I can think about the lives of all the humans who have ever lived and ever will live. Or I go even further and think about all life on the planet Earth. I can go even further and think about everything in our solar system, right? Still not even that big. I can think about our galaxy or local neighborhood in the galaxy. I can think about the whole universe. And all of a sudden, my concerns, whatever they might be, seem awfully small. Now, Tolstoy himself was really concerned and occupied with his own death and the death of everybody he knew and loved, and the fact that all of his projects were ultimately going to, in some sense, come to an end. Right? Ultimately, his concerns were going to terminate with his own death. So he considers 4 possible responses to the question. Now, these responses themselves, there's a little editor's note, Tolstoy in the text. I think it's the only note on this piece. Yeah, so if you go to page 16, there's a little note there put at the end of the piece where Klemke notes that a passage is omitted where Tolstoy characterized 4 attitudes that people can take toward life. And I've really just taken these from that spot there on page 16. So first is just to live in ignorance of the problem of the meaning of life, right? Just not be aware of it. Now, of course, certainly some people are not aware of it. I think most people, at least when we're young, before we reach a certain kind of reflective maturity, this just doesn't dawn on us as an issue or a question that can be asked. I think likely other creatures other than humans don't have the mental capacity to consider the question in the way that we do. So there are certainly other creatures, but I don't think this confronts them as an issue. I think humans up to a certain point in their life really aren't confronted by it as an issue. And it's quite possible that there are even some humans that go their whole life without ever thinking about this issue and really raising it as a possibility. Now, secondly, we can just try to ignore the issue, right? So be aware of it, but sort of self-consciously say, okay, I'm not going to engage with it. I want to put it off because I find it uncomfortable, and just trying to live a pleasurable life, all right? Just sort of be a hedonist is often the word that we used here. Third, admitting that life is meaningless and committing suicide. This was really what Camus was talking about in the introductory video when I was talking about the introduction to the topic and the introduction to the reader, right? Ask the question sincerely, look at it head on, answer it in the negative, is there a meaning to life? No. And so just end it. Right? If there's no point to it, there's no justification, why let it keep going? And we could do a whole other philosophy course on suicide because it's a very interesting subject and an interesting phenomenon. So we're, some says, not going to engage with it too fully here, but it's an option that some people take. And presumably the people who commit suicide are ones who think that there is no point in carrying on in life. Fourth, admitting that life is meaningless, but continuing to live aimlessly. Now, of course, these aren't the only 4 responses that are possible, because none of these have included a positive response that life really has a meaning. Here's what it is. That's what Tolstoy is going to come around to. But this is really the sort of list he comes up with of responses he sees in the people around him, people in his circle. And in fact, those people, the sort of the rich, the educated, the elite in Russia at that time, Imperial Russia, Tolstoy spends some time characterizing what those people are like, and he says, they're basically atheists, and typically they're fairly sort of liberal and left-leaning and progressive, scientific materialists and so on. And what did they do? Well, they lived in idleness, amusements, and tedium. Right? They didn't have faith. They had no meaning in their lives. So they fit into probably response 2 and 4 in particular. When he's looking around and describing people around him, they either just try to ignore this issue and just try to live a pleasurable life, or, right, they admitted that life is meaningless and just sort of carried on. Maybe not even trying to pursue pleasure, but just live. They wouldn't commit suicide. They wouldn't end it, but they thought life was meaningless. Tolstoy says at one spot in the piece when he's talking about his peers, he says, the more intelligent we are, the less do we understand the meaning of life, and the more do we see a kind of bad joke in our suffering and death. And in fact, he characterizes his own situation as feeling like the victim of a bad joke, that somebody sort of tricked him into caring about life up to that point when he was in his 40s or 50s. That whole time he was taking it seriously and pursuing his goals and trying to do all the things that he thought were really important. But then when he really stopped and thought about it, he realized that there was no good reason to think that his life really was meaningful or justified or purposeful, that it was worth all that effort, right? And as soon as that question came up and he started to take it seriously, he realized he couldn't find an answer to it. And so ultimately, for all the struggles and the suffering that life almost inevitably involves, just couldn't see it as anything but a kind of bad joke, a kind of trick, right? To lull somebody into life, to get them to care about so much, to put in so much effort and work, to suffer so much, all for nothing. Tolstoy thought that was sort of, beyond cruel. Now, Tolstoy takes a look at reason-based responses, really scientific responses. As I mentioned, when talking about what philosophy is, science is really comes from a Latin word scientia, which really just means knowledge. So we can look at science in some way as sort of a collective knowledge of humanity. This is really what it's aiming at. Now, Tolstoy, in looking to science to help answer this question of meaning, and this is what he was really sort of actively trying to do. Look around at the state of human knowledge, right? Looked at the sciences, the most sophisticated advances that were available during the time, and say, okay, so what's the meaning of life? What justifies it, and so on. Said, well, as soon as you look to science to answer that question, you're just turning your eyes away from the question itself. Why is that? Well, this has to do with something I've already been discussing in some of the other course content. Science is really descriptive, right? Science provides descriptions, and descriptions really aren't meaningful, at least not in the sense that descriptions don't provide any kind of justification. So what do the sciences provide? A kind of description about how the world works, right? It tells us what things are, it tells us their identity, right? Sort of tautologies, A equals A, right? We can redescribe what humans are. Humans are Homo sapiens. Humans are mammals. Humans are, right? We can give these sorts of explanations of what we are and how the world works. And in fact, Tolstoy draws on some of that, really. What does science tell me I am? A kind of chemical process, something that goes on for a certain period of time. We can talk about the average human lifespan. We can talk about the biological processes in the human body. We can talk about chemistry. We can talk about the elements that everything's made up of. We can talk about how the sun is going through the sort of reactions it is, and that produces heat and light, and that's what hits the earth. And photosynthesis is what lets plants sort of live, and then they draw on water, and we can talk about the ecosystem, and right. And again, I don't want to be pejorative. I think all that's very interesting and important. But Tolstoy's point is that none of that really gets to the question of meaning. As soon as you start getting involved in those questions and answers, what's this made up of, and what's this really like, and how does this system function, you're really just describing what's happening. But Tolstoy's point, and I think this is where he's somewhat clear, but also a little bit unclear. And that can be okay. He's an author, he's a literary person, and there can certainly be value in sort of not being fully clear in literature. But when it comes to philosophy, and we're thinking about matters philosophically, as I've indicated before, we want to try to be as clear as possible. So I think really a good way to try to clarify what Tolstoy is getting at is that science doesn't deal with normative matters. It doesn't deal with justifications, doesn't really deal with ultimate purposes and so on. And that's why as soon as we turn to science, ultimately we're turning away from the question, the real question. Tolstoy puts it another way. Science really only deals with the infinite. What it does is really explain or describe the finite, right? It can describe what humans are like, what each particular human life might be like, talk about averages and so on, talk about how different things fit together. But meaning, Tolstoy contends, really has to be infinite somehow, right? So even if we think about the largest explanation science can give us, how did the universe start? Oh, the Big Bang. And where's it headed? The heat death of the universe, ultimately. And here's how long you can expect the Earth to be around, how long the sun's going to be around, and here's how biological life works, and here's how chemical reactions work. And even if we had a full scientific explanation of everything, right? We could answer every question, we could describe every event, we could predict how things were going to work. That itself still wouldn't provide any kind of justification or purpose for everything, right? And even there, science really doesn't seem to be able to explain everything, because it has to explain one finite part in terms of some other finite part. So science can describe us, right? It can do a lot for us, but it doesn't really give us meaning. Tolstoy wants to reframe it this way. realize the spacing is a little bit funny now that I look at it on here. He reframed his question this way. He says, the question was, why should I live? Right? That is, right, or i.e. it est, in other words, right? Tolstoy says, the question, why should I live, is really the question, what real indestructible essence will come from my phantasmal destructible life? What meaning has my finite existence in the infinite world? The solutions of all possible questions of life apparently could not satisfy me, because my question, no matter how simple it appeared in the beginning, included the necessity of explaining the finite through the infinite and vice versa. So something I want to note here. This is the way Tolstoy is reinterpreting or reposing the question. This question, why should I live, as Tolstoy understands it and wants to rephrase it, requires that there's some kind of connection of the finite, namely him, right, some particular human life, to the infinite. Now we're going to see other thinkers later in the course reject that way of interpreting the question. So there is an interesting sort of lingering question here coming out of Tolstoy. Does a meaningful life have to have, a meaningful finite life, have to have some kind of connection to the infinite? Whatever exactly that is, he says, you know, infinite world here in the question. When I was talking about the age and size of the universe, it's tremendous. It quite literally goes beyond the human capacity to imagine. We can perhaps understand it, but we can't fully imagine the vastness and age of the universe. But it's not infinite, right? To be infinite means to be utterly boundless. Right? The in part is just really a negation. So to be infinite is just to be not finite. That is to be not limited. Does there really need to be a connection to the unlimited, the unbounded, for there to be meaning, whatever that is, for the finite? Tolstoy thinks so. And that is arguably an underlying assumption which drives him to the conclusion that he wants, or the conclusion that he reaches. Maybe it's not the one he wanted, because in fact, as we see him writing in this autobiographical part, and even the way he describes where he ends up, he thought his conclusion itself was sort of ridiculous, that turning to reason-based responses, turning to science first, was really the right thing to do. So when Tolstoy looks around his peers, other people of his class, and his education and so on, he says, they really didn't have an answer, right? They would turn to science. Science really doesn't give you an answer. Reason doesn't give you an answer. So what do you wind up with? You know, why keep living? Science just doesn't tell you that. It just doesn't engage with meaning, with justification, with purposes in that way. So he's left, in some sense, with nothing, or so it seems. This is where Tolstoy turned to the peasant class. And he really talks about the people who farmed on his farm. At that time, you know, in Russia, the serfs had been freed in the 19th century, but there's still sort of really a large class of people in Russia that were, you know, really sort of poor farmers who, you know, lived off the land and so on, really did not have much. And there were still, you know, estate holders, landowners, aristocratic people like Tolstoy that really possessed an awful lot of the wealth and property. So he looked to these people. So, you know, he had hundreds of people that worked his estate. And he himself didn't, you know, think poorly of them. In fact, he was interested sort of in them and how they lived. And that's really where he found, ultimately, what he takes to be the meaning of life. So, in looking to science, looking to the most sort of sophisticated answers, the best that reason could give us, what you get is really a negative. There's just no meaning to life, right? You're born, you live, you need to undertake certain activities to stay alive, right? You need to eat, drink, and rest, and so on. And then ultimately, what does it end in? Inevitably death, right? It ends in negation. It ends in nothing, right? You sort of die, the particles that make up your body come apart, right? They separate, your matter gets redistributed and gets taken up into other things. And eventually, right, unless you leave some kind of lasting mark like Tolstoy, quite honestly, it'll be, for all intents and purposes, forgotten fairly soon, right? If we think back just a couple of hundred years, How many people who lived full lives and toiled and worked and suffered and pursued their projects, who are now dead and have just left no mark, right? We have no written record. We can't even articulate their names and the years they were alive, right? There are so many people who are, in a large sense, forgotten, and even the ones that we have records of, right? I'm sure we have records of millions of people who have lived and died. But at some point, in some sense, it ceases to matter, at least in this finite temporal world. Perhaps there's some kind of indicator, there's a written record somewhere, but does it matter if nobody cares about it? If nobody reads it, if nobody has any kind of connection to that person and what they were like and who they were, if nobody cares? Tolstoy thinks, no, if you don't have that, then there just can't be any meaning. So in looking to the peasant class, Tolstoy really sort of asks and wonders, well, it seems like they've got some kind of positive answer, right? What's the meaning of life? Why go through all this struggle, right? These peasants, these farmers, right, in Russia who live poverty-stricken lives, they're very difficult. Why do they do it, right? And they seem to be able to do it cheerfully and to have satisfaction in their lives. But how could they do that, right? Well, really, it was faith. This is really what it was. And like I mentioned, Tolstoy himself regards faith in sort of a suspect manner. He puts it this way. He says that he understood that no matter how irrational and monstrous the answers might be that faith gave to the question of the meaning of life, they had this advantage that they introduced into each answer the relation of the finite to the infinite, without which there could be no answer. As he continues, no matter what answers faith may give, its every answer gives to the finite existence of man the sense of the infinite, a sense which is not destroyed by suffering, privation, and death. Consequently, in faith alone could we find the meaning and possibility of life. What then was faith, ultimately? And Tolstoy remarks that this is not just faith in the sense of saying a certain thing or giving sort of lip service to it or having it sort of on the back burner, so to speak. But it has to be a kind of lived faith, something that goes to your very core, something that makes up your worldview, who you are, how you act. When he talks about the people he interacted with, taking things like superstitions very seriously because it was really part of their faith. So what is faith really for Tolstoy? Of course, we can talk about faith as a kind of epistemic attitude or position. What do I mean by that? So epistemic, really adjectival form of epistemology. Epistemology is a noun. Philosophers made that up. It comes from a couple of Greek words. Basically means the study of knowledge or the theory of knowledge. So when I'm talking about something like an epistemic attitude or a certain part of epistemology, we're thinking about knowledge and what we can know. Of course, we can think in terms of reasons and reasoning, and as philosophers, that's really what we're interested in. But there's also a question of faith, right? And to believe something as a matter of faith is really to believe it without sufficient reason or sufficient evidence. We can put it that way. That's at least sort of minimally what faith is. But we can go further, and Tolstoy certainly does. As he puts it, he says, faith was the knowledge of the meaning of human life, in consequence of which man did not destroy himself, but lived. Faith is the power of life. If a man lives, he believes in something. If he did not believe that he ought to live for some purpose, he would not live. If he does not see and understand the phantasm of the finite, he believes in that finite. If he understands the phantasm of the finite, he must believe in the infinite. Without faith, one cannot live. So ultimately, Tolstoy himself came to a kind of religious awakening. He himself embraced faith, really led a whole new kind of life afterward, which he felt really gave him meaning. Now, there are a couple of interesting questions that comes up from what Tolstoy is saying here. So one is really, what exactly is he talking about here? So, faith is really this knowledge of the meaning of human life. It's the power of life. Now, presumably what Tolstoy is getting at is that having this kind of faith, or we could perhaps just even say belief, right? Belief in a certain kind of view of the cosmos, that really there's some sort of personal meaning to it, that there's this connection to the infinite, that we aren't just finite beings who are eventually going to end, and then that's just going to be it for us, but there's more, right? There's this interesting question, what exactly is that more? We're going to explore that a little bit in some of the other pieces we're going to look at, yep. But that there's this connection to the infinite, that there's somehow more to it. It doesn't just end in death, and that's just the end of us and all our projects and our impact and our meaning. But that somehow there's more to it. Now, we can pick apart a couple of different things, and this again is something we're going to go back to. We can pick apart the belief in that more, whatever it is, from its actual existence. So when we're thinking about, say, the afterlife, or God, or right, the existence of the soul or something like that, there's an interesting question that rears its head here, which is that can you lead a meaningful life if you incorrectly believe that there's more, right? That God exists and there's a soul and so on. Now, I'm not just sitting here telling you, oh, that's all false. Right? I'm just saying, look, for the sake of argument, just assume God doesn't exist, there's no soul, right? Once you're dead, that's it. You're dead and gone. The material world that we live in, and really what we observe, right, through the senses and everything, that's all there is. There just isn't any more to it, right? Any kind of religious belief is false. Right? For the sake of argument, just entertain it. If you then falsely believed in some of those things, and like Tolstoy, they seem to provide meaning, would your life really have meaning there? Right? Conversely, can you have a meaningful life if you don't hold those sorts of beliefs? It seems here, in this passage at least, Tolstoy denies that, right? You can't live. Without faith, one cannot live. Yet in the passages omitted, he was outlining ways in which people can live without faith, right? You can admit that there's no meaning to life and try to ignore the question and pursue pleasure. You can realize there's no meaning and live sort of aimlessly. What about saying that there's no meaning but actually continuing to engage in projects? What about rejecting the belief in the infinite, like faith, but still holding that there is in fact a meaning to life, that things are worth doing? It seems like here what Tolstoy is saying is that if you don't have faith, then you really can't live, or perhaps, to be more consistent with what else he says, without faith one cannot live well. One cannot live a meaningful life without faith, precisely because all of the sufferings and troubles of life ultimately will drag you down, and you just really can't stand against them. Something else I think it's worth just sticking in as a brief note here is really a question and sort of an invitation to reflect yourself on your own life, and how much it's really been touched by suffering, by real troubles. And I'm not just talking about, going back to my high school musings, it's not just a bad grade on an assignment, right? It's not something that can seem bad, right? Having a relationship end, say a loving relationship that sort of ends in a way you didn't want it to end, but it winds up ending that way. I'm talking about like real issues, right? That not these sorts of, and I'm including myself here, right? Not just the sort of first world problems of, oh, I can't get the, I don't know, color of car I want or something. I'm talking about death, right? I'm talking about terminal illness. I'm talking about troubles that we just can't overcome, because these things still exist, right? I've had at least one student in a past class when we were talking about funerals and this sort of thing, who had a realization that they'd never actually been to a funeral, right? They'd never really experienced death. And that itself was sort of a realization for them. And in fact, death in our society today compared to Tolstoy's time is very hidden away. We generally don't see people and things die. We might see a dead body, we might know about death, but the act of death itself, that transition between life and death, is hidden away almost as best as possible. It's tucked away in hospitals and care homes, and it's really pushed out of our conscience. One thing that this pandemic that we're currently living through might be sort of drawing to our attention is the reality of death. So I'd say, ask yourself, just reflect a little bit. How much experience have you really had with real hardship, right? And I'm not saying none of you have had real hardship. I'm not saying that either. But it's really a question to reflect. Because if you really want to understand Tolstoy and really understand his motivations, I think you have to tap into the deepest suffering you've ever experienced. And really ask yourself, what makes that worthwhile? And what if your life was characterized by that kind of suffering on a much larger scale? Right? What if you were experiencing very high levels of mortality around you like Tolstoy was? And again, think about our pandemic situation. We are experiencing a real uptick in that. But even what we're experiencing here with COVID-19 and increased mortality and all of the real hardships being posed by this, compared to a lot of experiences people have had to live through, this is pretty easy. And here again, I'm not trying to trivialize anybody who's suffering out there, whether it's being anxious or stressed out, contracting the virus, suffering through it, actually people dying from it or knowing people dying from it, financial hardships as a result of lockdowns. These are all real kinds of suffering. But think even deeper, right? Think about, what if this was 10 times worse, right? What if it was 100 times worse? What if, we were experiencing mortality rates like they were in the 16th or 17th or 18th centuries or even earlier, right? What if your odds of survival through infancy were actually pretty bad? Right? What if the odds were really good that, in fact, you were going to be struck down by some sort of illness or war or something by the time you were 30? Right? That's a different kind of world to live in, especially if you know that your loved ones are so vulnerable. And I know myself, I've experienced, I'd say, the phrase fair share of sufferings comes to mind, but I'm not sure there's such a thing as a fair share of them. I've had friends die, family members. Last summer, my dog, who I loved very much and blessed me for 9 years, my best friend, died in my arms. And I still feel devastated by that. Now, it doesn't hurt as much as it did, but I think about her every day. And I think about whether or not I'll ever see her again. I don't know about Tolstoy, but I know I can say for myself, my answer is, I sure hope so. And I'm fairly certain that's what motivated him as well. So I think with that, I'm going to leave this lecture here, invite you to reflect on your own experiences in life, both the things that have made it gone well, as well as the things that have made it go not so well. And think about Tolstoy's answer in this question. What is it that can give meaning to life? What is life? What are we talking about? What is the finite? What, if anything, is the infinite? Is there a connection between the two that's required for a meaningful life the way Tolstoy recommends? Is Tolstoy being consistent with himself, the way he closes the piece versus what he says earlier on in the piece? I'll leave these as issues for you to ponder as you engage with his work. And in the next video, we're going to take a look at Philip Quinn, who's going to give us another theistic perspective on the meaning of life and give us a few more distinctions and a few more details to think about. And I think you can take the Quinn piece and put it together with the Tolstoy piece in a very fruitful kind of fashion. So I'll leave this video here. I hope it's helped make some sense of Tolstoy's piece and given you something to think about. Until next time, have a great day.